Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about can the policies of President Trump return America and the American worker, the American citizen, return them to the golden age? And I'll use the golden age in terms of purchasing power of the paycheck. And its zenith, certainly over the last 100 years, came at around, somewhere between 1960 and 1970, and I'll just use 1970 as the baseline here. And this could apply pretty much across the whole Western world, give or take a few years either side. But the oil shocks of the early 70s sort of changed a few things. But the bottom line is that the purchasing power, the post-war purchasing power of the paycheck all across the Western world was on or about at its zenith in 1970. Now things have things have changed, since then, and the purchasing power of the paycheck, this is the average wage of the paycheck today, has barely 30% of the purchasing power it had in 1970. And if you factor in other things such as energy cost and food cost, it's about 25% of the purchasing power that it had in 1970. So this is a huge change, massive change. And it shows that in average wage terms, the standard of living of the Western people and the cost of living has declined by some 75%. Now, let's look at the overall mix here. Credit is much easier to get, far easier now than it was in 1970. And there are more government services and things like that. So if you look at the wider picture, it's not all total doom and gloom, but nonetheless, to live the sort of purchasing power, standard of living that you had in 1970, or that people had in 1970, then there'd have to be quite a heavy reliance on, or a much greater reliance on government services and on credit. So some would be in heavy debt, extreme levels of debt, in order to have that same purchasing power. The more prudent among us probably wouldn't go into that level of debt. So that is, our standard of living has to be sacrificed. But and I'll use an example of just how far things have gone, but gone downhill. But just to sort of illustrate the point in say rental terms. Now, if you look at the average rent the rents between 1970 and 1975, certainly in Australia, are barely moved over the 5 years. The rents sort of didn't really go up at all. So in that 5 years, unlike now where the rents are going up sort of every day, back at the time there was a lot of stability and continuity, not only in house prices but in rents and mortgages as well. Interest rates may vary, but the price of the house, the rents and so on, they stayed quite stable for quite a long time. For 5, 6, 7, 8 years at a time, and then would start to move. So there was a lot of, again, stability and continuity in not only rents but mortgages and general cost of living. So. And today that's not the case. The price of real estate, rents, purchasing property, and so on is just going through the roof, which is where most of the cost of living differential, purchasing power differential goes. But that's an essential of life. You could cut back on the non-essentials of life in order to trim your budget in the 1970s or 1970. But it's much harder to trim the budget today, given the majority of the costs that people have to bear are in rent, food and energy, transport, that sort of stuff. So they don't have that option, the variable of just saying, well, I don't need those things, I'll cut back on it. Today, the heavier costs and the heavier inflation are in the things that you must have. Therefore, discretion to deal with a tighter budget situation isn't there in the same way that it was in the 1970s or 50 years ago. So I just want to talk a bit about the difference. The average wage back in 1970 compared to, or anywhere between 1970 and 1975, compared to today, Now, the average wage is considerably 10, but depending on whose numbers you look at, it's between 9.5 and 11 times greater in just absolute numbers, the average wage. But yet it still buys you 70% less than it did in that 1970 thing. So the in order to sort of balance it out, to have a wage that had the same purchasing power as it did in that period 1970 to 1975, and being reflected in the cost of living, the average wage in Australia at least would need to be over 200,000 a year. This is the average wage, and that's three times more than it is in reality. So even if you adjust for, say, 2 household incomes, it's still the purchasing power is still, even a household with 2 average incomes still has less purchasing power than 1 income did in 1970. Now, say renting a apartment or something at $500 a week. Well, again, in order to have that rent reflect the purchasing power of the current paycheck, the rent would need to drop to about $175 a week. So from 500, it needs to be $175 a week to have the same purchasing power implications on the average wage paycheck. So if we look across the board in electricity, in energy generally, food and rent, there needs to be very substantial decreases in those prices, again, rent, mortgage, the whole thing, by roughly 60 to 65%, give or take, in order to restore the approximate equilibrium of the purchasing power. So if we're going to have as it was in the 70s, so if we're going to restore purchasing, if we're going to have a golden age, the only way that can happen is by restoring the purchasing power of the paycheck. It can't happen any other way. You say, well, it can happen by just more government handouts. No, it's not going to happen that way. It has to come from the purchasing power of the paycheck. Only when that is restored to golden age levels, the 1970s, only then can we have a golden age. And without that, there can't be a golden age. No amount of government giveaways or free lesbian dance PhD courses, none of that is going to bring put the purchasing power back. And it's only through that. The number of people that are paid the big bucks in Western economies has again, relative to purchasing power, has shrunk quite considerably. Like the amount of jobs in Australia that pay enough money for someone to live in a middle class, the tree line street thing, pay a middle class lifestyle and have children and that sort of thing. Barely 1% of the jobs pay enough money to do that. And even then, you would need sort of long-term continuity in employment. If you're going to drop in and out of that top 1%, then you still couldn't do it. So it goes to show how few people. Whereas, again, in the early 1970s, approximately 3/4 of the population, the dude working in the factory, the guy who was pumping petrol at the full-service gasoline station, all that sort of stuff, they could afford to have a family. The guy driving the taxi could afford to buy a house and have a family, and so on. So that's of course all changed today. So purchasing power of the paycheck is the only way it's going to happen. So what are the prospects for President Trump, who appears to be quite earnest in his desire to go, bring America into a golden age? How is this going to happen? Now, again, the levers to do that aren't many. Reduction in the price of food, energy, and accommodation. That's how it's only going to come from that. So how will this happen? How will now, if there's mass deportation of illegals and the mass ownership of residential property by the Black Rocks and the State Streets, those Vanguards and so on, is done, then there would be, I think, decent reductions in rent. People just wouldn't be able to rent, so they'd have to sell. if they sell at a cheaper price, then that brings down the price of real estate in order to avoid a collapse in real estate prices, which nobody wants. Things are overpriced, the bubble is out of control. But the only way to, I think, to avert that is to offer intergenerational mortgages where the banks can't profiteer, and structured in such a way that the cost of the reduction in residential property is a place to live, other than if you're a property developer. It shouldn't be, I think, a profitable enterprise. It should be, other than the cost of you maintaining that property and so on, you shouldn't be able to sell it at a profit beyond that. It's a place to live. And real estate was treated for hundreds, thousands of years that way. And if you look in the rural parts of Europe, the properties just handed down through the generations to, so sometimes families have been living in that house for several generations. And this is a more desirable thing. Should money, because it's not productive money, should money be pouring into these things, into real estate, when the only outcome is that people have to pay more, and that the likes of the vanguards and so on are able to profiteer obscenely from such behaviour, such financial behaviour. So the price of real estate can either come down sharply, but then that will require intergenerational mortgages, or it needs to be stabilised, totally stabilised, and then time will amortise the cost down as wages gradually increase, and therefore the price of property becomes relatively cheaper. I don't think that's going to work, because it would take too long. It could take 30, 40 years to do that, because nobody wants high inflation in wages. So the only way to do this, I think, is to reduce the price of rents and mortgages, but then amortize the effect of that cost shift over multiple generations of ownership. I think that's the only way to do it, or syndicate ownership, something like that, private syndicate ownership, not corporate. Now, in terms of food production and cost of the essentials, groceries, that sort of thing, we've seen a cost increase of food and groceries across the world simultaneously, to about the same level. Whether the country has vast surpluses of wheat or none at all, the price is approximately the same. So clearly the globalists are centrally controlling the price of food and are allocating, everybody will pay X amount of dollars for eggs or bread or milk or this. So it's a global, effectively a globalist, global cartel pricing food without any regard to the cost of inputs or the availability of raw materials such as wheat or herds of cows or whatever. So this is something that that cartel, that pricing cartel, needs to be broken up, and aggressively so, and that will substantially reduce the price of food. But to what extent, I don't know, but I would think, given the price rises since the end of COVID, during and the end of COVID, have been in the region of 40 to 50%, then that would be the potential margin of price reduction that would be on the table as a possibility. When we look at energy, which is the next major got to pay cost, and now the Green New Deal stuff, which again, globalist orchestrated yet again, supposedly to save the planet when it's doing nothing of the sort, that cost, that the energy is 75 to 80% more expensive than it needs to be. Now, in places like Australia, with vast resources of gas and good quality, easy to get out of the ground coal, then the price of energy in Australia would be, again, 20 to 25% of what we're currently paying in Australia. It wouldn't necessarily be exactly the same in each country, but the price could come down very substantially. So if you look at the cost of, say a family of three, let's just take a simple sort of, the mum, dad, and the kid type thing, and the cost of groceries, and food and groceries generally, then this would be something in the order of saving of $3,000 to $4,000 a year easily, without anything, just in dealing with those costs. similar to the cost in energy. Again, a saving of $2,500 to $3,500 there. And then you look at the bringing rents down to be in line with what wage increases have been. So the relative purchasing power from the 1970s, then rents would drop very considerably by, again, 60-odd%. So if we just take an average rent, then that would be $15,000 to $18,000. So approximately $24,000 to $27,000 a year in costs. Again, this is just for the essentials of life. Could be taken out of that cost system. It's again been orchestrated. Nothing organic about it. It's been orchestrated by the globalists. So this would very substantially increase the purchasing power of the paycheck. But other than doing this, again, because the heavier costs and the heavier inflation have been in the essentials of life, not the optional things of whether you buy the latest flat screen television or something like that. That's those sort of optional things aren't where the big inflation is. Or even in motor vehicles, if you look at motor vehicles, the competition there, other than where you had EVs being forced on companies, but the look at motor vehicles, you get a much bigger and more featured motor vehicle now. So in the overall scheme of things, they're not really that much more expensive than they were in 1970. So you look at this in the overall, this is the things that the incoming Trump administration needs to do. There's nowhere else you can go. Making flat screen televisions cheaper isn't going to change anything. Making mobile phones cheaper isn't going to change anything. It has to come, the quality of life, the cost of living, the purchasing power of the paycheck is only going to come by addressing those three things: accommodation, whether it's rent or mortgage, accommodation, roof over the head, food, and this is the essentials of food. Again, things like eggs, bread, milk, and so on. And then the cost of energy. If those three things are addressed with vigor and gusto, then that will have a huge, monumental effect on the standard of living of Americans, and indeed, as the flow-on occurs, other Western citizens. And if that's addressed, then yes, the Western worker, and particularly the worker in the United States, the citizen, will return to something resembling a golden age, but only if those issues are addressed. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.